The entire town of Millbrook fell silent when they brought her to the auction block that October morning in 1889. She stood there in torn rags, her wrists bound, her dark eyes burning with defiance, even as blood trickled from a cut on her lip. The auctioneer called her Savage Beauty, like she was livestock, and the crowd of respectable citizens stared at her exposed shoulders and broken dignity as if they were examining a prize horse. What happened next would tear apart everything. Millbrook thought it knew about itself, but it started with one man who couldn't stand to watch another human being stripped of their humanity. Let me tell you about the day Marcus Reed changed everything by simply treating someone like they mattered. Marcus had ridden into Millbrook that morning to buy supplies, not to witness what the town fathers called a lawful seizure and sale of unclaimed property. He'd heard whispers about it at the general store, how they'd found a wild Indian woman living alone in the hills and decided she needed to be civilized or sold to someone who could make proper use of her. The auction block stood in the center of Main Street, surrounded by a crowd that should have been ashamed of themselves, but seemed more curious than troubled. Marcus pushed through the gathered townspeople, his jaw tightening with every step as he got a clearer view of what was happening. She couldn't have been more than 25, with long black hair that had been roughly cut and copper skin marked by recent bruises. Her traditional native dress had been replaced with torn remnants of white woman's clothing that hung loosely on her thin frame, clearly meant to humiliate rather than protect. But it was her eyes that stopped Marcus cold. Despite everything they'd done to her, despite standing half-naked before a crowd of strangers, she held her head high and stared back at them with the fierce pride of someone who refused to be broken. "Now then," called out Jeremiah Walsh, the town's self-appointed auctioneer and banker, "we'll start the bidding at $50 for this fine specimen. She's young, strong, and with proper training could make an excellent domestic worker." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't legal anywhere in the United States, not since the Civil War ended 24 years ago, but Millbrook was 3 days' ride from the nearest federal marshal, and apparently the town had decided to interpret the law in their own creative way. "Do I hear 50? Walsh continued, scanning the crowd with the enthusiasm of a man selling prize cattle. A voice from the back called out, $50. It belonged to Silas Morton, who owned the largest ranch in the county and had a reputation for working his hired hands nearly to death. $60, shouted another voice. Marcus looked around at his neighbors, people he'd known for years, watching them bid on a human being like she was a piece of farm equipment. These were the same folks who filled the church pews every Sunday and talked about Christian charity and the brotherhood of man. The woman on the block never flinched, never showed fear, even as the bidding continued around her. She was scanning the crowd too, but not with hope of rescue. Marcus could see she was memorizing faces, planning something. Even bound and outnumbered, she wasn't giving up. $100, Morton called out, his voice cutting through the morning air. Walsh smiled greedily. $100 from Mr. Morton. Do I hear 110? That's when Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. Standing near the front of the crowd was a small group of men he didn't recognize, wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as from back east. They were watching the proceedings with professional interest, and one of them was taking notes in a small leather book. These weren't local ranchers looking for workers. These were buyers who'd come specifically for this auction, which meant Millbrook's lawful seizure wasn't a spontaneous decision. This had been planned, organized, and probably advertised in places where such things were still considered acceptable business. The woman's eyes found Marcus in the crowd, and for a moment their gazes locked. He saw no plea for help there, no desperation or hope. Instead, he saw the kind of quiet dignity that reminded him of his own mother during her final illness. when she'd faced death with courage that had humbled everyone around her. $125, one of the Eastern men called out. Marcus felt something snap inside his chest. He'd spent 4 years fighting in the Civil War, watching good men die to end exactly this kind of evil. He'd come home believing that America had finally learned to treat all people as human beings. He'd been wrong. Marcus pushed through the crowd toward the auction block, his boots echoing on the wooden platform as he climbed up. The auctioneer looked surprised, but not alarmed. Buyers often wanted a closer look at expensive purchases, but instead of examining the woman like merchandise, Marcus began unbuttoning his heavy wool coat. The crowd fell silent as Marcus draped his heavy coat around the woman's shoulders, covering her torn clothing and restoring a measure of dignity to her bearing. She looked up at him with surprise, then something that might have been gratitude, though her expression remained guarded. He could feel the weight of every eye in Millbrook watching them, and the tension in the air grew thick enough to cut. "What in blazes do you think you're doing, Reed?" Jeremiah Walsh sputtered, his face turning red beneath his bowler hat. "Get down from there. This is a legal proceeding." Marcus turned to face the crowd, his hand resting protectively near the woman's shoulder without actually touching her. "Legal according to what law, Walsh? Last I checked, we fought a war to settle the question of whether human beings could be bought and sold in this country." "She's not a citizen," Walsh shot back. "She's unclaimed property, living wild on territory that belongs to civilized folks. We're doing her a favor by finding her proper employment." "Employment?" Marcus's voice carried the kind of quiet authority he'd learned as a cavalry officer. "Is that what you call it when someone's bound with ropes and sold to the highest bidder?" Silas Morton pushed forward from the crowd, his massive frame and perpetual scowl making him look like an angry bull. "Reed, you're interfering with legitimate business. That woman was caught stealing from my ranch, living like an animal in the hills. She needs someone to teach her proper Christian ways." The woman beside Marcus spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady despite her circumstances. "I never stole from your ranch, Mr. Morton. I gathered wild herbs and berries from land that belongs to no man." Her English was perfect, with only the slightest accent, and Marcus could see the surprise on several faces in the crowd. They'd expected broken speech from their savage, not the articulate response of an educated woman. Morton's face darkened. "You see? Defiant and argumentative. She needs a firm hand to break her of such notions. The only thing that needs breaking. Here is this illegal auction," Marcus replied. He looked directly at the Eastern men who'd been taking notes. "And I'm curious why buyers traveled all the way from Chicago for a spontaneous seizure of unclaimed property." One of the Eastern men stepped forward, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as someone with serious money. "Mr. Reed, I presume. I'm Theodore Blackwood, and I represent certain business interests that specialize in difficult labor situations. This woman would be well cared for in our establishments." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. He'd heard whispers about such establishments, places where people disappeared into lives of forced labor disguised as legitimate business. What kind of establishments? Domestic service agencies, primarily. She'd learn useful skills, earn her keep, and contribute to society instead of living wild in the mountains. "Domestic service," Marcus repeated flatly. "Is that what you call slavery these days?" The crowd stirred uneasily. Several people who'd been enthusiastic bidders suddenly found their shoes very interesting to look at. Walsh waved his gavel angrily. "This auction is proceeding whether you like it or not, Reed. Either bid or get off my platform." $500, Marcus said quietly. The crowd gasped. It was more money than most of them saw in a year, enough to buy a good horse and saddle. With cash left over, Blackwood's eyebrows rose, but he smiled coldly. 600, 1,000, Marcus counted without hesitation. 1,500, Blackwood shot back, his voice revealing his first hint of irritation. Marcus reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded document. Actually, Mr. Walsh, before we continue this illegal proceeding, you might want to look at this. He handed the paper to the auctioneer, who unfolded it with shaking hands. Walsh's face went white as he read, and he nearly dropped the document. "What is it?" Morton demanded. Walsh's voice came out as a croak. It's a federal writ, signed by Judge Harrison in Cheyenne. All auctions of human beings in this territory are suspended pending federal investigation." The woman beside Marcus straightened, and he felt her surprise at this turn of events. Truth was, Marcus had been carrying that writ for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to serve it. He'd heard rumors about Millbrook's auctions and had ridden to Cheyenne specifically to get legal backing to stop them. Blackwood's pleasant mask slipped completely. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious," Marcus replied. "And I believe there are federal marshals about 3 hours behind me, very interested in discussing your domestic service agencies with you." Blackwood and his associates didn't wait around to discuss their business practices with federal marshals. Within minutes of Marcus revealing the federal writ, the Eastern men had mounted their horses and disappeared down the main road in a cloud of dust, leaving behind a crowd of increasingly uncomfortable townspeople who were starting to realize they'd nearly participated in something that could land them all in federal prison. Walsh dismissed the auction with obvious relief, and the crowd began to disperse quickly. Conversations conducted in guilty whispers. Nobody wanted to be seen lingering at the scene of what was clearly about to become a federal investigation. Marcus helped the woman down from the auction block, noting how she moved with careful dignity despite her obvious injuries. Once they were away from the worst of the crowd, she stopped and looked up at him directly. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because it was right," Marcus replied, "and because what they were doing reminded me too much of things I fought a war to end." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I am Nayeli Yazi. My people are Diné, what you call Navajo. I thank you for your intervention, but I need to know your true intentions." Marcus appreciated her directness. "My name is Marcus Reed. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of here. My intentions are to see you safely away from these people and back to your family, if that's what you want." "My family is dead," she said matter-of-factly. "Killed by soldiers 3 winters ago when they tried to force our band onto the reservation. I've been living alone in the hills ever since." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd known there were still bands of native families trying to live free, but he'd hoped the worst of the violence was behind them. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be helpful." Nayeli's eyes were sharp and intelligent, evaluating him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "These people will not give up easily. They've been hunting me for weeks, ever since I started gathering evidence of their activities." "Evidence?" Nayeli reached inside Marcus's coat, which still hung around her shoulders, and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. "They've been doing this for months, not just to me, to others. People from my nation, from the Lakota, from the Cheyenne. Anyone they could catch living free." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal several folded papers covered in careful handwriting. Names, dates, descriptions of buyers. "I've been watching them, following their wagons, recording everything." Marcus stared at the documents. "You've been investigating them?" "Someone had to." Her voice carried a bitter edge. "Your federal marshals don't come looking for missing Indians. But I learned to read and write at the mission school before my family left the reservation. I know how your system works." The papers detailed a network that stretched across 3 territories, with buyers from as far away as California and Texas. The scope of it was staggering, and Marcus realized that what had almost happened in Millbrook was just a small part of something much larger. How long have you been gathering this information? 8 months. Ever since my cousin disappeared from a trading post in Fort Collins, and I heard rumors about where she might have been taken. Nayeli's jaw tightened. I never found her, but I found evidence of many others. A commotion at the end of the street caught their attention. 3 riders were approaching fast, and Marcus recognized the lead horse. Sheriff Davis was returning from whatever business had conveniently taken him out of town during the auction. He's part of it, Nayeli said quietly, following Marcus's gaze. Davis gets a percentage of every sale. That's why he's never around. When the auctions happen, Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. How much of the town government is involved? Enough. Nayeli carefully rewrapped her documents and tucked them back inside the coat. Walsh, Davis, Morton, probably the mayor. They've been careful to only target people who wouldn't be missed, people living outside the reservations. Sheriff Davis reached them, his face red from hard riding. Reed, what's this I hear about you disrupting a legal proceeding? Marcus pulled the federal writ from his pocket and handed it over. Just serving some federal paperwork, Sheriff. Nothing you need to worry about. Davis scanned the document, his expression growing darker with each line. This is highly irregular. I should have been notified of any federal investigation in my jurisdiction. Maybe you would have been, Marcus replied evenly, if you'd been in town instead of conveniently absent during an illegal slave auction. The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun, but he caught himself when he noticed several townspeople still watching from doorways and windows. You're making some serious accusations, Reed. I'm making observations. The accusations will come later when the federal marshals arrive. Nayeli stepped slightly behind Marcus, not from fear, but from tactical awareness. He knows the marshals are really coming, she said quietly. He's calculating whether to run or fight. Davis chose to fight, but not in the way Marcus expected. Instead of drawing his gun, the sheriff smiled coldly and pulled out a different piece of paper. Funny thing about federal writs, Reed. This one here says I have authority to arrest any person suspected of harboring fugitive Indians pending investigation by territorial authorities. Marcus felt his blood turn cold as he realized the trap they'd walked into. Davis had been prepared for federal interference, and the corrupt network had legal documents of their own. That's a territorial warrant, Marcus pointed out. Federal law supersedes territorial authority. Not when the federal marshal isn't here yet, Davis replied, his hand now resting casually on his gun butt. And not when I have reasonable suspicion that you're interfering with the lawful recovery of stolen property. Nayeli moved closer to Marcus, her voice low and urgent. The documents I gathered include proof that Davis falsified territorial warrants, but we need to get them to honest authorities. Several of Davis's deputies had materialized from various buildings around the town square, Marcus noted. This had been planned as carefully as the auction itself. They'd expected federal interference and prepared for it. Here's what's going to happen, Davis announced loud enough for the remaining townspeople to hear. Mr. Reed is going to hand over the escaped Indian, and then he's going to ride out of Millbrook and forget what he thinks he saw here. And if I refuse? Davis shrugged. Well, there's been a lot of Indian trouble lately. Folks might understand if a known Indian sympathizer met with an unfortunate accident while resisting arrest. Marcus felt Nayeli tense beside him, and he knew she was preparing to run. But running would mean abandoning the evidence she'd gathered. Evidence that could save countless other people from the same fate. That's when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the town square. A lot of horses, moving fast and in formation. The federal marshals had arrived early. Marshal William Hendricks rode at the head of a column of 12 armed men, their badges glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind them came 2 wagons full of additional. personnel, and what looked like a mobile court setup. Davis's confident expression cracked as he realized he was suddenly outnumbered by federal authority. Marshal Hendricks dismounted and approached the group, his eyes taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who dealt with corrupt local officials before. "Sheriff Davis, I presume? I'm Marshal Hendricks. We're here to investigate reports of illegal human trafficking in your jurisdiction." "This is highly irregular," Davis protested. "You have no authority." "Actually, I have complete authority." Hendricks produced his own set of documents, Presidential Directive, signed by Benjamin Harrison himself. Any person found to be buying, selling, or transporting human beings for forced labor will be arrested and tried under federal law. Nayeli stepped forward, Marcus's coat still wrapped around her shoulders. "Marshal Hendricks, I have evidence of a network operating across 3 territories." She handed over her carefully wrapped documents, and Hendricks scanned them quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "Names, dates, locations, financial records," the marshal murmured. "This is incredibly detailed work." "Miss Yazzie has been investigating this network for 8 months, Marcus explained, "at considerable personal risk." Hendricks looked at Nayeli with genuine respect. "Ma'am, this is exactly the kind of evidence we needed to break up this operation permanently." Davis made one last desperate play. "You can't trust the word of a savage against respected members of the community. I can trust documented evidence." Hendricks cut him off. "And I can trust the word of a woman who risked her life to gather proof of crimes against her people." He gestured to his deputies. "Arrest Sheriff Davis, Mayor Walsh, and bring me Silas Morton." As the federal marshals took control of Millbrook, Marcus found himself standing beside Nayeli in the town square, where just hours before she'd been displayed like livestock. "What will you do now?" he asked. "Help the marshal identify other victims, testify at the trials, make sure this network is completely destroyed." She looked up at him. "And then maybe visit your ranch if the invitation is still open." Marcus smiled. "It is, though I should warn you, it's pretty quiet out there." After 8 months of hiding in caves and dodging bounty hunters, quiet sounds. Perfect. As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Marcus reflected on how one moment of choosing compassion over convenience had unraveled an entire criminal network. Sometimes the most important battles were won not with weapons or strategies, but with the simple decision to treat another human being with dignity. The woman they'd called Savage Beauty had turned out to be the most civilized person in the entire town. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that courage comes in many forms, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, can change everything. What's your most powerful story of witnessing someone stand up for another person's dignity? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. Thank you for watching, and remember, true strength isn't measured by power over others, but by the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves.